For a long time, the Romantics were one of my favorite eras of poetry, one of my favorite genres of poetry, however it is that you want to refer to the Romantics. Since that is sort of passed for myself, but I think that there is still a great hall of romantic poetry, and today's poem is probably in that hall of fame. And welcome to Strip Coverlet, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I'm Andrew Fort, and we are here for another poetry discussion, which will take place in the poetry discussion playlist, now approaching 600 videos strong. The poem in question today is Thy Days Are Done by Lord Byron. Before we get into it, I want to float this out there about the poem. There are three generally sort of accepted interpretations of the poem. There is an interpretation that this poem is about random soldier. There is an interpretation that this poem is about Byron himself dying. And I will save my favorite interpretation for after the poetry reading. 1. Thy days are done, thy fame begun, thy country's strains record, the triumphs of her chosen son, the slaughters of his sword, the deeds he did, the fields he won, the freedom he restored. Though thou art fallen, while we are free, thou shalt not taste of death. The generous blood that flowed from thee disdain to sink beneath. Within our veins its currents be, thy spirit on our breath. 3. Thy name, our charging hosts along, shall be the battle word, thy fall the theme of choral song. From virgin voices poured, to weep would do thy glory wrong. Thou shalt not be deplored. Now, those three levels. Number one, the soldier, the random soldier. Obviously, that interpretation is there. This, I think that rather than random soldier, if this romantic poem were to be taken at its base level about anything, it would be a hero of the golden age, right? You're talking Achilles, perhaps. You're talking one of these famed Greek heroes that are maybe euhemerized. Is that what it's called? Euhemerization, where a person did something so great that they are sort of fabled gently into the realm of God or a god. This is so. I wish I had looked up the term before I started talking, but there's a euhemerization, I believe is the correct term. That is one of the more recent movements concerning in biblical studies what Jesus was. They think Jesus perhaps was a a famed scholar of the Jewish religion. He was pretty good at what he did, had some wild ideas about the religion that ended up being beneficial to his followers. All of a sudden, he dies, maybe is actually literally crucified, and then the idea of him is spread. And the next time, so someone tells another person about that idea. That person tells another person. But maybe there's a couple extra things in there. 10 generations along, that person's a god, right? So I think that this is one of those types of deals on the basic level. I don't think this is about random soldier, but I think that this is about a person who has reached the level of hero. But then, obviously, that's not, if we are to accept that uh, a poem is a symbol for something else, there are levels to the poem, then no, the poem isn't about a hero. It's about a hero, but it's not about a hero, right? The obvious original subject of the poem is the hero, but the deeper meaning, then we can take that to be Byron. The the assumption of, so a lot of the romantic poets, I think in particular, would romanticize the idea of their own death. And I don't think that they had to be particularly close to their own death for this to be sort of a tantalizing subject for someone who was writing romantic poetry. It's the ultimate denouement. It's the ultimate type of fall, the death itself. So you can make that no clearer to yourself than to write about your own fall, write about your own death. So in the poem, if we are accepting the base level as about either a random soldier, which is possible, or the hero idea, then that hero is used to symbolize Byron's own death. So let's read it one more time and see if we can pick up on anything if we're accepting the fact that this is about Byron's own fall. Thy days are done, thy fame begun, the country strains record of the triumphs of her chosen son, the slaughters of his sword, the deeds he did, the fields he won, the freedom he restored. Well, if you're writing this about yourself, it's a bit presumptive, perhaps, but though thou art fallen, while we are free, thou shalt not taste of death. The generous blood that flowed from thee disdained to sink beneath. Within our veins its currents be, thy spirit on our breath. This is accepting the fact, if this is written by Byron himself, that his words will live on. And here we are. It is currently November 2024, and we're still talking about this poem. So a bit egotistical, but is it egotistical if you're right? Thy name, our charging hosts along, shall be the battle word, thy fall the theme of choral song, from virgin voices poured, to weep would do thy glory wrong. Thou shalt not be deplored. This is saying that not only will the name be carried on, but the practice, perhaps the practice of romantic poetry. I think that the Romantics, one of the girdling beliefs to Romanticism might be, and this might be sort of, this might be unique to Romanticism. I think that the Romantics would tell you they had it right, that this was the use for poetry, that this was what poetry was supposed to be. So this idea that perhaps Byron believed that not only would his words live on, but that the idea of romantic poetry as well would. Now, here's my favorite idea for the interpretation of this poem. The Romantics were kind of writing at an interesting time for literature. The Romantics, so poetry had at one time been the only form of literature. The Romantics came along at a time where now plays were more prevalent, novels were really starting to be written, the widespread use of music was their music with lyrics. These competing forms of literature kind of put the clamps down on poetry. Perhaps one of the competing factors, something that we're reading chapter by chapter on the channel right now, Frankenstein. So the idea of the novel even was being dichotomized. There were now genres. The science fiction genre birthed through Frankenstein. Interesting connections here. Poetry finally reaching this level, I think, that the Romantics would have believed was distilled to perfection. suddenly had competing forms that were prevalent, right? So things had popped up, but poetry, before the printing press, everything really had to be memorized. So storytellers told stories in epic fashion through the form of poetry. The printing press comes along. Oh, yeah, you can print a whole lot of poems that way. You can also print the Bible that way. The Gutenberg press, the Bible, right? Those are very valuable. They sell those by the page, right? Very interesting. But you could print novels. You could print newspapers, things that literally had to be read now while they were new. So there was a lot of competing forces for poetry. What if Thy Days Are Done is about poetry? Let's read it one more time. Thy days are done, thy fame begun, the country's strain record, the triumphs of her chosen son, the slaughters of his sword, the deeds he did, the fields he won, the freedoms he restored. Well, now that stanza becomes really interesting. Thy days are done, thy fame begun. Before, that doesn't really ring true for many things. But if you're talking about the downfall of poetry itself, thy days are done. Okay, we've talked a little bit about what that might mean for poetry, all these competing forces, thy fame begun. Sure, poetry might not any longer be the primary form of storytelling. It's really hard to quote novels. If someone passes on to you a quote from a poem in conversation, you think a little more highly of them, don't you? The country's strains record, the triumphs of her chosen son. How often do we hear, in correlation with a novelist, their country of origin? I think it's not really that often. No one really says American novelist Michael Crichton. You say science fiction novelist Michael Crichton. No one really says American novelist Ernest Hemingway. You just say Ernest Hemingway. But what about poetry? How often do we hear about a poet's nationality? Fairly often, I think. The slaughters of his sword. Poetry itself, killing. Well, yeah, charged ideas. The deeds he did, the fields he won. In Flanders Field? Now, obviously that was written after this, but you get my drift. The freedom he restored. What is the ultimate freedom? Right there in your mind. The ultimate freedom is the freedom of thought, without which the freedom of soul, the freedom of self can never begin. Though thou art fallen, while we are free, thou shalt not taste death. The generous blood that flowed from thee disdained to sink beneath. Within our veins its currents be, thy spirit on our breath. The spirit of poetry itself. How interesting an idea. The spirit of poetry itself be on our breath. The poets will live on. Poetry may be dead, the poets never will be. Thy name our charging hosts along shall be the battle word. Thy fall, the theme of choral song from virgin voices poured. To weep would do thy glory wrong. Thou shalt not be deplored. The Romantics refused to let the idea of poetry, the practice of poetry, though it may be diminished, they refused to let it be deplored. They refused to let it die. Its days are done. That suggests death. But what is death? Should any of us hope to live on past our lives, it would be through the words of others. They say that you die two deaths. You die the last breath you take, and you die the last time your name escapes someone's lips. The romantic poets herein, if this poem is about poetry herself, himself is deigning to say, "We will not let you die that second death." That is all I have for this poetry discussion. If you like or appreciate what it is I do here, hitting the like button really does help me out, as it tells YouTube to share this video with other literature lovers. If you find yourself here by chance but not design, consider hitting the subscribe button to stick around for more literature content in the future. There's poetry on the channel every Monday, and I hope to have you back for the next one.